Hinduism believes that a soul has to go through multiple experiences before it achieves perfection and becomes one with the ultimate divine. While being created, an individual's soul is separated from the undifferentiated one. As it evolves, and as it progresses on earth, some manage to go back to the Creator, their source, while some continue their existence and take a little while. But why do we reincarnate? According to Hinduism, our unfulfilled motives and desires are liable for rebirth. When people with 40 unfulfilled desires pass away, desires which can only be fulfilled on earth, while they are in another world, they strongly long for their fulfillment. These desires bring them back to earth, causing reincarnation or rebirth. There are many beliefs in Hinduism that science does not believe in. One such belief is rebirth or reincarnation. And for Western audience, it is an incomprehensible thought and a superstition. According to Hinduism, after death of a person, only his body perishes, not his soul. The soul leaves the body and enters another body, which is decided based on the actions or karmas of the previous birth. This is called reincarnation. The Bhagavad Gita states, "Never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be." As the embodied soul continuously passes, in this body, from childhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. A sober person is not bewildered by such a change, and worn-out garments are shed by the body. Worn-out bodies are shed by the dweller within the body. New bodies are donned by the dweller, like garments. We are always fascinated by stories of reincarnation, especially children who are reincarnated, as they seem to remember amazing details of the past life. Most people put it down to their child's imagination. How can anybody really remember a past life? Is it even possible? Surely when we are born we come into the world for the first time, and experience only those memories from birth, childhood, then into adulthood. To believe in reincarnation, sometimes we have to change our whole mindset or even faith to do it. And talking about faith, what happens if in one life we are Jewish? Then when we are born again, we are possibly a Catholic or even Methodist? What does that mean? So many questions. It's even harder for the parents. How must they feel knowing that their child is screaming, "I want my real mother"? Most times it's easy to dismiss the words, putting it down to childish imaginings. But other times, well, they can't be dismissed so easily. While many scientists will dispel the notion of reincarnation as a myth, Dr. Ian Stevenson, a Canadian-American psychiatrist who worked at the University of Virginia School of Medicine during more than 4 decades, Stevenson investigated the reincarnation-type experiences of thousands of children, both in the West and in the East. This video about 5 proven real mysterious reincarnation incredible stories of rebirth in common man that are every bit true. Who was Anne Frank? Anne Frank was born Anneliese Marie Frank in Frankfurt, Germany, on June 12, 1929, to Edith Hollander Frank and Otto, a prosperous businessman. Less than 4 years later, in January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and he and his Nazi government instituted a series of measures aimed at persecuting Germany's Jewish citizens. Anne Frank, a young Jewish girl, her sister Margot, and her parents moved to the Netherlands from Germany after Adolf Hitler and the Nazis came to power there in 1933 and made life increasingly difficult for Jews. In 1942, Frank and her family went into hiding in a secret apartment behind her father's business in German-occupied Amsterdam. The small area was cramped and claustrophobic. Living in such abysmal conditions, Anne found her freedom by writing in a diary her father had bought on her 13th birthday. Throughout their hidden years she captured each emotion, girlish thought and fear, writing it down purely to keep herself busy. On August 4, 1944, police in Nazi-occupied Amsterdam raided a warehouse being betrayed by one of their helpers and arrested 8 Jews who were hiding in an annex disguised behind a bookcase. Among those captured was Anne Frank, a 15-year-old schoolgirl who had spent over 2 years living in the cramped safe house with her parents and older sister. Anne Frank ironically died just a few days before the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, around 15th of April 1945, possibly from typhus, but the real cause was never known. She had been at the camp less than a year. British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April 1945. Thousands of bodies lay unburied around the camp and some 60,000 starving and mortally ill people were packed together without food, water or basic sanitation. Many were suffering from typhus, dysentery and starvation. The Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, which occupied approximately 6 square miles of one-story, single-room huts surrounded by barbed wire, initially served as a prisoner of war camp. Over time, it was transformed into a horrific concentration camp for Jewish people and inmates from other concentration camps. The British Army immediately began to organize the relief effort. Their first priorities were to bury the dead, contain the spread of disease, restore the water supply and arrange the distribution of food that was suitable for starving prisoners in various stages of malnutrition. Additional military and civilian medical personnel were brought in to support the relief effort. The British faced serious challenges in stabilizing conditions in the camp and implementing a medical response to the crisis. Nearly 14,000 prisoners would die after liberation. Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank, was the only member of the group to survive. He was liberated from Auschwitz by Soviet troops on January 27, 1945. When Otto Frank returned to Amsterdam following his release from Auschwitz, Gus, he was a secretary of Frank, gave him 5 notebooks and some 300 loose papers containing Anne's writings. Gus had recovered the materials from the secret annex shortly after the Franks' arrest by the Nazis and had hidden them in her desk. Margot Frank also kept a diary, but it was never found. Otto Frank knew that Anne wanted to become an author or journalist, and had hoped her wartime writings would one day be published. Otto Frank helped compile them into a manuscript that was published in the Netherlands in 1947 under the title Het Kete Huis, Rear Annex. Although U.S. publishers initially rejected the work as too depressing and dull, it was eventually published in America in 1952 as The Diary of a Young Girl. The book, which went on to sell tens of millions of copies worldwide, has been labeled a testament to the indestructible nature of the human spirit. It is required reading at schools around the globe and has been adapted for the stage and screen. Did you know? In 1960, the building at Prinsengracht 263, home to the secret annex, opened to the public as a museum devoted to the life of Anne Frank. Her original diary is on display there. Barbro Curley was born in Sweden in 1954. Her first book was published at the tender age of 12. It was a book of poetry. The book has gone on to be one of the most popular books in Sweden. But it's her early life that is most startling. Ever since she was a small child, she dreamed of another life. The fear would overcome her and she would wake up shaking and frightened. She had the horrible dreams for as long as she could remember. The most startling thing began when she was about 2 years old. She told her mother and father that her name was not Barbro, it was in fact Anne. Her mother dismissed it as just a fantasy. Barbro carried on having the dreams, and couldn't understand why she felt she was living in 2 worlds. By this time she knew that her name was Anne Frank, and couldn't understand why they kept calling her Barbro. She realized that they were not her real parents even though they insisted that they were. Barbro had no one else to talk to, and continued to insist that she wasn't who they said she was. At this time the diary of Anne Frank had only been translated into a few languages, but definitely not Swedish. There is no actual date of publication in Sweden, but it's believed to be in the late 1950s. By the time Barbro was 10, the diary of Anne Frank had been published and distributed in Sweden, and her parents had become aware of who the historical Anne Frank was. While in Amsterdam, her father wanted to visit the Anne Frank house. At their hotel, he took the phone off the hook and asked for a taxi to take them there. Barbro suddenly exclaimed, "We don't need a taxi, it's not far to walk from here." Barbro was so certain that it didn't occur to her parents to object. They just meekly followed her as she walked off. "We'll soon be there," "It's just round the next corner," Barbara told her parents. She herself wasn't at all surprised when they arrived at the Anne Frank house after a 10-minute walk through the twisting streets of the city. An image of the Anne Frank house is provided to the right. Upon their arrival, her parents stood there speechless and just looked at one another. A boy named Cameron Macauley who was born in Glasgow, Scotland. Cameron lives with his mother, Norma. Cameron has been telling stories of his life on Barra, a remote island in the Outer Hebrides. The family had never been to Barra as it was some 220 miles from his current home in Glasgow. It can only be reached by a lengthy sea journey or an hour-long flight. It is a distant outpost of the British Isles. Around the age of 2, he started mentioning the incidents and details of his past life, the white house he lived in, the black and white dog he walked on the beach. He talks about his mother, 7 siblings and his father, Shane Robertson, who died when he was run over by a car. Norma is not convinced. She does not believe that Cameron has ever watched programs that could have provided this information. Norma's next step is a visit to Karen Majors, an educational psychologist whose specialty is children and their fantasy lives. She considers that Cameron's accounts are very different to normal childhood imaginary friends. Eventually, his parents took Cameron to the island and they found the White House and the beach exactly as he drew it. Remarkably, Cameron knew the inside and out of the house, even showing them a secret entrance. Cameron's past life on Barra. One of the strangest subjects was the toilets. He used to keep complaining that, on Barra, his parents had 3 toilets. He also spent ages drawing his house, a long, white building standing on the beach. He would sit on his chair talking about his parents and brothers and sisters, and as time went on, he got more and more upset about leaving his other mother. He would cry continuously and say that he wished his mother could see that he was all right. The story soon came to the attention of a film company, and after listening to his story, Cameron's nursery school teacher suggested that maybe they should film him and go to the island. After setting up a meeting, the film company agreed to take Cameron to Barra. They were also escorted by Dr. Jim Tucker, a child psychologist. When Cameron was told he was going, he couldn't stop jumping up and down. "I'm going home, I'm going home," he shouted. Upon reaching the island, they were astonished to find that they had indeed landed on the beach. Cameron started to run around yelling, "I'm back." Gossiping away about his Barra mother, he told everyone that she had long brown hair that fell all the way down her back and that she read him stories from the Bible. Cameron's mother stated that they were not particularly religious and had never done this at home. They soon booked into a hotel and started to search for clues to Cameron's past. After contacting the Heritage Center to find out about the house, they were unable to find records about any house being owned by the Robertson family overlooking the bay. To say they were disappointed would be an understatement. They drove around the island looking for the house but couldn't even see one that resembled Cameron's description. Then they realized that they were looking in the wrong direction. The planes that Cameron saw would be coming in from the wrong side of the bay. They realized that if Cameron saw them from his bedroom window, they had to be going the other way. Eventually, the hotel phoned them and told them that yes, there was a Robertson family home on the other side of the island. So they started to drive Cameron there. They didn't tell him where they were going, but when they arrived, Cameron jumped out of the car and ran straight to the house. He knew it immediately. But as Cameron walked through the door, he began to get very pale and quiet. Up until now, he had recognized the exact gate at the front, he knew where to go and was so excited. But upon entering the house he stood to one side, slightly uncertain. Then he took off, running around the house, pointing out all the rooms where he had lived. He showed them all the nooks and crannies and the 3 toilets. Much to his mother's surprise, when they went into the garden, he took them to his secret entrance that he had been talking about for years. Pramod Sharma was born on October 11, 1944, in Basauli, India. When Pramod was about 2.5, he began telling his mother not to cook his meals for him any longer because he had a wife in Moradabad who could cook. Moradabad was a town about 145 km from northeast of Basauli. Between the ages of 3 and 4, he began to speak in detail of his life there. He described several businesses he had owned and operated with other members of his family. He particularly spoke of a shop that manufactured and sold biscuits and soda water, calling it Mohan Brothers. He insisted that he was one of the Mohan brothers and that he also had a business in Saharanpur, a town about 100 miles north of Moradabad. Pramod tended not to play with the other children in Basauli but preferred to play by himself, building models of shops complete with electrical wiring. He especially liked to make mud biscuits which he served his family with tea or soda water. During this time he provided many details about his shop including its size and location in Moradabad, what was sold there, and his activities connected to it, such as his business trips to Delhi. He even complained to his parents about the less prosperous financial condition of their home compared to what he was used to as a successful merchant. Pramod had a strong distaste for curd, which is quite unusual for an Indian child, and on one occasion even advised his father against eating it, saying that it was dangerous. Pramod said that in his previous life he had become seriously ill after eating too much curd one day. He had an equally strong dislike for being submerged in water, which might relate to his report that he had previously died in a bathtub. Pramod said that he had been married and had 5 children, 4 sons and 1 daughter. He was anxious to see his family again and frequently begged his parents to take him to back Moradabad to visit them. His family always refused his request, though his mother did get him to begin school by promising to take him to Moradabad when he had learned to read. Pramod's parents never investigated or tried to verify their son's claims, perhaps because of the Indian folk custom that children who remembered a previous life were fated to die early. News of Pramod's statements, however, eventually reached the ears of a family in Moradabad named Mohrar which fit many of the details of his story. The brothers of this family owned several businesses in Moradabad including a biscuit and soda water shop named Mohan Brothers. The shop had been started and managed by Pramod Mohra until his untimely death on May 9, 1943, 18 months before Pramod was born. Pramod had gorged himself on curd, one of his favorite foods, at a wedding feast, and had subsequently developed a chronic gastrointestinal illness followed later by appendicitis and peritonitis from which he died. 2 or 3 days before his death, he had insisted, against his family's advice, on eating more curd, saying that he might not have another chance to enjoy it. In the summer of 1949, the Mohra family decided to make the trip to Basauli to meet Pramod, who was a little under 5 years old at the time. When they arrived, however, Pramod was away with his family and no contact was made. Shortly thereafter, Pramod's father responded to an invitation from the Mohra family and took him to Moradabad to explore his son's compelling remembrances firsthand. Among those who met Pramod at the railway station was Pramod's cousin, Shri Karamchand Mohra, who had been quite close to Pramod. Pramod threw his arms around him weeping, calling him older brother and saying, "I am Pramod." It is common for Indians to call a cousin brother if the relationship is a close one, as was the case for Pramod and Karam. Pramod then proceeded to find his way to the Mohan Brothers shop on his own, giving instructions to the driver of the carriage which brought them from the station. Entering the shop, he complained that his special seat had been changed. Pramod's special seat had in fact been changed some time after his death. Once inside, Pramod asked, "Who is looking after the bakery and soda water factory?" This had been Pramod's responsibility. The complicated machine which manufactured the soda water had been secretly disabled in order to test Pramod. When shown it, however, Pramod knew exactly how it worked. Without any assistance, he located the disconnected hose and gave instructions in its repair. Later at Pramod's home, Pramod recognized the room where Pramod had slept and commented on a room screen that he correctly observed had not been there in Pramod's day. He also identified a particular cupboard that Pramod had kept his things in as well as a special low table which had also been his. "This is the one I used to use for my meals," he said. When Paramanand's mother entered the room, he immediately recognized her and addressed her as mother before anyone else present was able to say anything. He also correctly identified Paramanand's wife, acting somewhat embarrassed in front of her. She was, after all, a full-grown woman and he was only 5, though apparently possessing at least some of the feelings of an adult husband. When they were alone he said to her, "I have come but you have not fixed bindi," referring to the red dot worn on the forehead by Hindu wives. He also reproached her for wearing a white sari, the appropriate dress for a Hindu widow, instead of the colored sari worn by wives. Pramod correctly recognized Paramanand's daughter and the one son who was at the house when he had arrived. When Paramanand's youngest son who had been at school showed up later, Pramod correctly identified him as well. Gus Taylor of San Francisco, USA, died 1 year before the birth of his grandson, was named Gus Taylor. When Gus started talking he tells everyone that he is Gus Taylor, the grandfather. The family members laughed it off and think this was just a child imagination. One day he found an old photo album. He became excited when he found a fixture of a car and he said it was his old car, which was the first car Gus Taylor bought. His parents tried to test him this time by seeing him a picture of his grandfather when he was in school. Even though August was in school uniform and with his classmates, Gus identified him within seconds. But the biggest shock came when Gus told everyone that he used to have a sister who became a fish. Finally this proved to everyone that he was really Gus Taylor because when August was a child his sister was murdered and thrown into the river and it was explained to little August that his sister had become a fish. Just when he started talking, he kept on claiming that he was his own grandfather. Gus Taylor was 18 when realized that he was his own grandfather, Augie, reborn again. His family thought that he might be having some mental or identification problems. But no, this was more than that. Shockingly, when he was 4 years old, he identified his grandpa's picture from a family photograph. He identified himself as Augie from the photo before any of his family members told anything about it. Also, it is reported that Gus spoke about how Augie's sister was murdered in the San Francisco Bay. Surprisingly, none of the family members ever told him about the murder story. When asked, Gus told that after his death God had given him a ticket that took him to a hole. It was through that hole by which he traveled to his new life as Gus Taylor. James Arthur Flowerdew was born in Norfolk, in England 1906. He had visions of being in a city in the middle of a desert and at one side a temple that had been cut into the mountainside. An elderly man from Norfolk in England called Arthur Flowerdew, who from the age of 12 experienced inexplicable but vivid mental pictures of what seemed like some great city surrounded by desert. One of the images that came most frequently to his mind was of a temple apparently carved out of a cliff. These strange images kept coming back to him, especially when he played with the pink and orange pebbles on the seashore near his home. As he grew older, the details of the city in his vision grew clearer, and he saw more buildings, the layout of the streets, soldiers, and the approach to the city itself through a narrow canyon. Arthur Flowerdew much later in his life, quite by chance, saw a television documentary film on the ancient city of Petra in Jordan. He was astounded to see, for the very first time, the place he had carried around for so many years and those pictures in his mind. He claimed afterward that he had never even seen a book about Petra. However, his visions became well known, and an appearance in a BBC television program brought him to the attention of the Jordanian government, who proposed to fly him to Jordan along with a BBC producer to film his reactions to Petra. His only previous trip abroad had been a brief visit to the French coast. Before the expedition left, Arthur Flowerdew was introduced to a world authority on Petra and author of a book on the ancient city, who questioned him in detail, but was baffled by the precision of his knowledge, some of which he said could only have been known by an archaeologist specializing in this area. The BBC recorded Arthur Flowerdew's pre-visit description of Petra, so as to compare it with what would be seen in Jordan. Flowerdew singled out 3 places in his vision of Petra: a curious volcano-shaped rock on the outskirts of the city, a small temple where he believed he had been killed in the 1st century BC, and an unusual structure in the city that was well known to archaeologists, but for which they could find no function. The Petra expert could recall no such rock and doubted that it was there. When he showed Arthur Flowerdew a photograph of the part of the city where the temple had stood, he astounded him by pointing to almost the exact site. Then the elderly man calmly explained the purpose of the structure, one that had not been considered before, as the guard room in which he had served as a soldier 2,000 years before. A significant number of his predictions proved accurate. On the expedition's approach to Petra, Arthur Flowerdew pointed out the mysterious rock, and once in the city he went straight to the guard room, without a glance at the map, and demonstrated how its peculiar check-in system for guards was used. Finally he went to the spot where he said he had been killed by an enemy spear in the 1st century BC. He also indicated the location and purpose of other unexcavated structures on the site. Please subscribe my YouTube channel and press the bell icon so you'll be notified when I publish a new video on my YouTube channel.